Good morning. My name is Patrick Rohrer. Thank you very much for tuning into my talk, where I'm going to be talking about our M3D, or multimodal multidimensional labeling scheme for the annotation of audiovisual corpora. So let's get started. First, of course, Cospeech gestures are intimately related to speech. I don't think it's a very controversial statement to make at a conference like this. And we know that one of the arguments for this really close relationship with speech were McNeil's 3 synchrony rules. So of course we have the phonological synchrony rule that says that the stroke must co-occur with a stressed syllable or come just before it. We also have the semantic synchrony rule, which says that the semantic meaning in a gesture must go along with the semantic meaning in speech, and similarly for the pragmatic meaning of gesture going with the pragmatic meaning of speech for the pragmatic synchrony rule. So we have these 3 synchrony rules, but whenever we think about them and then we think about gesture classification schemes, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect because these gesture classification schemes tend to present different categories that we should put these gestures into, but they don't quite match up with the way we conceive these synchrony rules. So for example, if we look at one in particular, the probably most common gesture classification scheme by McNeil, it's important to note that McNeil himself sees these not necessarily as individual categories into which each gesture fits neatly, but we should see these more as dimensions. So you can have different levels of iconicity or metaphoricity or deixis. But there's still this sort of presupposition in the field that you have a gesture type when you have a gesture. And of course, we also have to take into account that the gestures on the left, the iconic, metaphoric, and deictic gestures, are all referential gestures that are defined on their semantic function. So each of these brings semantic meaning, and so this is how they have been classified. On the other hand, on the right side, we have the beat gesture, which instead of being classified by its function, it's classified by its form. It's been defined as a simple up and down movement that adds emphasis to speech. So if we look at this sort of gesture classification system, we see that the gestures don't really fit neatly into categories, and these categories also sort of lead to some presuppositions. So for example, that the gestures on the left are merely conduits of semantic meaning through oftentimes complex hand forms, and the gestures on the right are meaningless, simple rhythmic markers. And for us, we believe that this sort of categorical approach towards gestures and this sort of grouping, this way of grouping gestures is sort of untenable when working with real-life data. And we think that we need a more comprehensive analysis of gesture production. So some of the reasons why we believe this: first, we can look at the term beat gesture and this group of gestures, let's say. Like I said, these are traditionally defined by form as being simple up and down movements of the hand, while the other gesture types have been defined by their function. But if we look at the form, studies have shown that, of course, these gestures can also have complex forms. They can include preparation, strokes, holds, etc. Another thing is that we don't believe that these gestures are meaningless or limited to adding emphasis, but in fact, they bring a very wide range of pragmatic value to speech. And the term beat itself we find it problematic because, of course, this sort of implies that there's a very particular relationship with rhythm and prosody that's different from the other gesture types. But in fact, we know that not all beat gestures are related to rhythm and prosody, and we also know that all other gestures are related to rhythm and prosody at very similar rates. So for these reasons, we're going to make use of the term non-referential gesture. We believe it to be a little bit more neutral. So if I say non-referential gesture, I'm talking about this group of gestures with the McNeilian sense of a beat gesture. Another thing to take into account is the pragmatic meanings. So, for example, we also know that referential gestures don't only contribute semantic meaning, but they can also contribute pragmatic meanings as well. For example, if you look at the categories described in Kendon, he oftentimes gives examples of what could be considered as referential gestures that are imparting a pragmatic meaning. Other studies in the field that have looked at the pragmatic contributions of gestures, there's also a very strong focus on form, where people have looked at the palm up open hand gesture or the ring grip precision grip gesture, etc. There's still a very big focus on form. And finally, we believe that more comprehensive analysis should include all bodily movements. The field of gesture studies as a whole is focused on manual gestures, whereas we know that there's a need to account for other body movements, and not only head nods, head movements, eyebrow movements, but also things like torso leans or even, moving your feet. So for this reason, we take the broad definition of gesture as described by Kendon, that is any bodily movement that is communicative. So based on these, we do think that there's a need for a holistic and integrative approach towards the annotation of gestures. So in comes the multimodal multidimensional labeling scheme, or M3D for short. M3D, the goal was to go back to the original 3 synchronies that were proposed by McNeil that I discussed before and annotate around these 3 synchronies. And so we've created essentially 3 dimensions that we think should be annotated for when looking at gestures. Now, before I go in and look at each dimension and describe each one, there's a couple of general things that I want to mention about M3D. First, it's implemented in Elan, and for prosodic annotations, they're often carried out in Prot. And we have written out a labeling manual and have created Elan template files, and we'll be placing those online. So you have the website right here at the bottom if you're interested in checking it out to get more details about the actual annotation procedure and using the system yourself. And finally, the idea is that this is a flexible system that can be adapted to individual research questions, so you can choose exactly how precise you want to make your annotations. But we also want it to be a flexible system in the sense that it can work for all bodily movements, and that any sort of speech act as well could be accounted for. So if you're looking at interactive speech versus non-interactive, academic speech or children's speech or anything like that, that the system is able to be adapted to fit those needs. And finally, something a little bit more about the structure of M3D is it follows the tier hierarchy system in Elan, where the parent tier refers to the articulator that you're annotating, and subtiers are available for each subdimension or each dimension, and there are child tiers within that. So to give you an overall idea of what it looks like, it sort of looks like this. So you have your manual articulator, which would be your parent tier, and then underneath that you have your form dimension with its child tiers. You have your semantic pragmatic dimension with its child tiers, and the prosodic dimension with its child tiers. So now let's go into looking at each dimension themselves. So the form dimension, I think this is pretty straightforward. It doesn't deviate from many of the other sort of annotation schemes that have been proposed. But basically it includes the physical and kinetic aspects of the gesture, where we use annotation values based on the MIT coding manual. And so what we have sort of deemed as sort of the most appropriate would be to code for handedness, hand shape, hand or palm orientation, trajectory shape, and trajectory direction. Again, if you want to add more detail to this, then feel free, or maybe a little bit less if it depends on your research question if you want to make use of it. And another point to mention here is that the form dimension does account for whenever the hands are moving together in a symmetrical way, or you can also code for each hand individually. So if one hand is gesturing and the other hand is doing something else, you can code for them individually as well. In addition to the actual physical and kinetic aspects of the gesture, we also include here gesture phasing, where we use the typical gesture phases that were originally described by Kendon, so preparation, hold, stroke, recovery. We've also added an incomplete stroke. And then on a separate tier, we code for the apex, as described by Jeseník et al., and lower as sudden stops or changes in direction, etc. So I'm going to give you an example of annotation of the form dimension. I'm going to play it one time really quick. Turn the volume up and play one. time.
De façon efficace.
It says to defend your interests in an efficient manner, right? Basically, here you can see that this is the annotation for the left hand. The hand shape, it starts as a fist, goes towards more of a relax, and then comes back to fist. With the orientation towards himself, the orientation moves towards his head and then up before going back to himself. And the trajectory, shape, and direction, he goes straight up. Then it kind of curves down and forward, and then he goes straight to himself. And then we annotated this section here as the stroke. So now I'm going to play it in slow motion for you. So you can see the whole thing that it's kind of a straight up, and this curve down in self is where we see the stroke, and this change in direction here is where we would put the apex. All right. Now let's move on to the semantic and pragmatic dimension. Basically, this dimension accounts for any semantic or pragmatic contribution from the gesture. So we have a semantic tier, which we also just call a gesture type. I mean, it roughly corresponds to McNeil's gesture types, and it's really used to determine its referentiality to speech. So we would code for referential iconics, metaphorics, dialectics, and then non-referential gestures, and then also conventional or emblematic gestures. And then in the pragmatic tiers, we created sort of, it's largely based on Kendon's proposals for pragmatic categories, where we ourselves have added 3 extra categories. So you can see them all right here. So the top ones are what Kendon proposed. Then the bottom 3, we added information structure marking, expressive marking, and lexical access. But one thing that's very important to mention here is that these tiers, all of them, they can be duplicated to account for multiple semantic or pragmatic meanings. So, for example, the main one is this idea of gesture type, like I said earlier, right? We want to think about these more as dimensions, and we don't want to limit ourselves to categories. So if, for example, somebody is talking about the future and they point to somewhere in front of them, you can argue, is that a dialectic gesture or is that a metaphoric gesture? Well, in the M3D system, you just duplicate the semantic tier and you put one annotation as metaphoric, the other one as dialectic, and there you capture both dimensions of that gesture. So, so this is why we think that the M3D system is able to capture and go beyond these sort of categorical annotations. And as for the pragmatic categories, this is still somewhat of a work in progress. These are the big categories that we have so far, along with their functions. For time's sake, I'm not going to go through and explain all of these, but this is definitely a work in progress. It's still going to be developed, but this is sort of what we've started working with right now in our corpora. All right, so here I'm going to give you 2 examples of annotations for the semantic and pragmatic dimensions. So the first one is a non-referential gesture that is marking information structure.
This geoengineering idea is...
So it says this geoengineering idea, and this geoengineering, it falls within the topic portion of the sentence. It's not the focus, and it is also a referent that is new, that has not been described in the discourse previously. So here we would mark the information structure with the information status of the referent and whether it was in the topic or the focus of the sentence. And here is another an example of a gesture showing epistemic stance, showing certainty.
And I know for certain that that will work.
So I think this example is pretty straightforward because he straight up says, I think I know for certain, right? And he uses this sort of what's been described in the literature as a precision grip gesture to really show his certainty. And finally, we have the prosodic dimension. So the prosodic dimension accounts for the relationship between gesture and prosody at 2 different levels. So we have a perceptual level where we call it the prominence association component, where basically the annotator looks at the gesture, listens to the speech together, and makes a judgment on whether that gesture seems to associate with the prosodic prominence or not. And if it does seem to associate, you annotate it with a plus, and if not, a minus. And that's just merely to look at the alignment from a perceptual stance. But you can also look at it at the acoustic level, where you would do independent prosodic annotations, usually in prod, and then import those annotations into Elan. And this allows for more comprehensive assessment for quantitative analysis, where you can look at things like distance in milliseconds to the nearest prosodic landmark, and you can add any sort of detail that you would like. So far we've looked at the prosodic landmarks of pitch accentuation and prosodic boundaries, but of course you can always add more information. And you can choose also how you want to annotate your the prosody of speech. So you can look at something like, traditional Toby systems or rapid prosodic transcription or something like that in order to get your prosodic annotations. So here's an example. Again, it's that first example that I showed you where he says efficace. And we already see, let me play the video first.
De façon efficace.
So the annotator annotated the stroke and put a plus in what we have labeled here as the prosodic component. There's the plus sign showing that the annotator perceived the stroke as occurring with a prosodic prominence. And then it was labeled with French Toby, and we see that indeed that first syllable does have an initial accent. So the stroke does indeed overlap with a pitch accent. All right. So now for the last couple of minutes, I just want to show some results that we've gotten from applying M3D to our corpora. We have two preliminary studies that I'm going to show you. The first one is about non-referential gestures as phrase markers in French. So basically, we wanted to understand the temporal alignment of non-referential gestures with pitch accentuation and prosodic phrasing in French, where pitch accents tend to mark prosodic edges. So we're developing a corpus of French TED Talks. So far, we have 2 speakers and 13 minutes of speech, and we annotated the form dimension. We annotated referentiality. We didn't go into the pragmatic aspect of this dimension, but we also did comprehensive prosodic dimension annotations. And we looked at whether gestures occurred with phrase initial accents, phrase final accents, or with no accentuation. And when it occurred with no accentuation, we looked at the syllable that co-occurred with the apex, in which position within the phrase it fell. And what we found was that the strokes and apexes of non-referential gestures align with pitch accentuation at rates much lower than those reported for other languages. So in this graph, you see the purple is the number of beat gesture apexes that do not co-occur with a pitch accent. So you can see, for example, this speaker, nearly 50% of his gestures do not co-occur with a pitch accent. So rates much lower than previously reported. And interestingly, when we looked at the gestures that did not align, when we looked at where they're falling within this phrase, we found that they follow a pattern very similar to what the initial accent does when it is present. So usually the initial accent will mark the first 2 syllables and then will greatly decrease after that. And we see that non-referential gestures follow this same pattern. So potentially non-referential gestures may serve a demarcative function for the left boundary of the prosodic phrase. And this was found thanks to the comprehensive labeling of the prosodic dimension from the M3D. The other study is about the development of marking information structure with non-referential gestures in children's narratives, where we wanted to determine the longitudinal development of gesture production and their pragmatic functions as information structure markers in a narrative retelling task. So we used the audiovisual corpus of Kaplan Children's narrative speech development, where we took a subset of 23 participants, about 28% of the data, and we coded the information structure marking of the manual articulators, particularly in terms of information status of a manual gesture's referent, whether it was new, given, or accessible. And what we found was that manual non-referential gestures have a tendency to mark discourse new reference more often than discourse given or accessible reference. Meanwhile, iconic gestures don't really seem to show any clear pattern. And interestingly, these patterns are already acquired at an early age. So this time 1 is at 5 years of age. Already this pattern is there. And then 2 years later, the pattern is still there. And this was found thanks to the comprehensive labeling of the semantic and pragmatic dimension. So to wrap up, basically the M3D scheme offers a novel approach to gesture labeling that can be applied to a wide range of bodily movements and different speech acts, and offers a holistic perspective of gesture's relationship to speech in terms of form, in terms of its relationship to prosody, and in terms of its semantic and pragmatic contributions. So we think that using M3D would be great because from one simple corpus, you can answer a multitude of research questions. And finally, M3D, we want to be able to adapt to fit the needs of the researcher, and we're always looking to improve. So with that being said, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing any comments you might have and answering any questions.